Have you ever wondered how someone could be born into wealth, power, and royalty, and still vanish from the pages of history? Not in the dramatic sense, no dark alley, no carriage gone missing, but slowly, quietly, like a candle that simply burns down until there's nothing left but a wisp of smoke. That's exactly what happened to Princess Margaret, the sister of Henry VIII. Now I know what you're thinking. Henry VIII again. Haven't we heard enough about him? And you'd be right to ask. His 6 wives have been picked apart more times than a holiday turkey. But Margaret, she was his sister, a queen in her own right. And yet today most people couldn't tell you a single thing about her, which is exactly why we're talking about her. Because some stories don't get shouted, they get whispered. And whispered stories are often the ones closest to the truth. So, tonight or this afternoon, whenever you're watching this, I want to invite you to slow down with me. Maybe you've got your favorite tea in hand. Maybe the house is finally quiet. Or maybe you just want a moment to listen to something soothing, something thoughtful, something that lets you drift between history and reflection. Let's begin in the early 1500s, in the royal courts of Tudor England. Life then wasn't just about palaces and pearls, it was about survival, especially for women, and especially if you were born with royal blood. Margaret Tudor was born in 1489, daughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. That already makes her interesting. She was born to unite the houses of Lancaster and York after the brutal War of the Roses. Her blood, quite literally, was political glue. But Margaret wasn't just a princess in a tower. She was the older sister of the future Henry VIII. And as any of you who've had younger siblings might know, being the eldest has its burdens. You carry expectations, you lead the way. And back then, that also meant your marriage wasn't really yours, it belonged to the crown. So at the tender age of 13, Margaret was shipped off to Scotland to marry King James IV. Yes, 13. Just imagine that. One day you're a child playing with your ladies-in-waiting, and the next you're packed into a ceremonial coach, told to smile and wave, and sent over the border to become queen of a foreign land. And yet, Margaret adapted. She became Queen of Scots, mother to future kings, and unlike many royal brides, she was genuinely loved by her husband. James IV, despite the political nature of their marriage, was said to be kind to her, even affectionate. And in their early years, Scotland flourished. But life rarely holds steady for long, does it? In 1513, everything changed. Margaret's husband rode off to war, against her own brother, Henry VIII, no less. The two kings were on opposite sides of a European conflict, and when the dust settled at the Battle of Flodden, James IV lay dead on the battlefield. Margaret was now a widow. Queen Dowager, and mother to the infant King James V. Now pause with me for a second. Imagine being just 24 years old, recently widowed, in a foreign land where your accent still makes people whisper. Your baby son is king, your late husband's. Enemies are circling and half the court doesn't trust you because of your English blood. But Margaret didn't shrink. She stepped forward. She declared herself regent, essentially acting ruler on behalf of her son, and she fought hard to hold that position. For a while she held it well. She negotiated, she governed, she kept things running, but politics, as we all know, can be cruel, especially to women, especially to foreign women. And then Margaret made a move that sealed her fate. She remarried. To Archibald Douglas, Earl of Angus. And that changed everything. You see, back then, a queen regent was expected to stay politically neutral. Marrying a powerful noble, especially one as ambitious as Angus, was seen as a betrayal. Her authority crumbled. She was pushed aside. And her new husband? He turned out to be less partner, more problem. He was power-hungry, manipulative, and more loyal to his clan than to her. Their marriage became a battle of wills. At one point, he even took custody of her son and refused to let Margaret see him. And there it is again, that quiet disappearance. Not a vanishing act in the dramatic sense. No, this was slower. Margaret, once a queen, once a regent, once a daughter of kings, was being erased by the people around her, bit by bit. Decision by decision, until she was a political inconvenience. A mother locked out of her own son's court, it's a painful thing, isn't it? Being strong, being smart, being royal even, and still finding yourself silenced. And yet Margaret didn't give up. Even in the shadows, she found ways to write letters, to plead her case, to press for reunification with her son. She travelled. She bargained. She navigated a web of Scottish politics that would have unravelled most men. And despite everything, despite the betrayal, the coldness, the rejection, she kept going. Not because she was power-hungry, but because she knew her worth, and that's something I think we can all relate to. Sometimes life doesn't hand us the happy ending we expect. Sometimes we're left out of the story entirely, but that doesn't mean we disappear. It doesn't mean we stop mattering. Margaret's story isn't just about a lost princess, it's about resilience, about holding your dignity when the world tries to push you aside. And as we get older, we understand that feeling in ways we didn't when we were young. We know what it means to be overlooked, to be underestimated, to be told, "You've had your turn." But Margaret reminds us gracefully, quietly, that our voice still matters. The thing about losing your place in the world, whether you're a queen or simply someone who's been told you're no longer needed, is that it doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, like water slipping through your hands. You're holding on until you realize you're not. Margaret Tudor felt that, deeply. When we left her, she had lost her husband in battle, remarried a man who quickly became more enemy than ally, and had been pushed out of her role as regent. Even her son, her own child, was taken from her and placed in the custody of nobles who thought her loyalty was too English for Scottish politics. And yet she didn't fade away. No, Margaret did something many women of her time, and even ours, rarely get credit for. She adapted. She left the court, yes, but not in surrender. She wrote, she negotiated. She reached across borders, across enemies, even across the cold silence between siblings. And here's where things get even more fascinating. She reached out to her brother, King Henry VIII. Now, if you've ever had a complicated sibling relationship, this might sound familiar. They don't call, they forget your birthday. But the moment you need something, suddenly they have opinions. Margaret asked Henry to support her return to power, to help her regain custody of her son, to help her reclaim a voice in the country. She had ruled on behalf of her child. And for a while, Henry played the role of concerned brother. He even sent some support. But Henry VIII wasn't known for his compassion. And he certainly wasn't known for being generous to people, especially women, when they stopped serving his goals. So Margaret waited. And while she waited, the world shifted again. Her second marriage, to Archibald Douglas, grew colder by the year. Eventually, she left him. She sought a divorce, which in Tudor times was a scandalous move, particularly for a woman. Divorce meant shame. It meant politics. And for Margaret, it meant risk. But still, she moved forward. It's one thing to face public judgment when you're young and full of fire. It's another thing entirely to face it later in life, when you've been bruised by disappointment and worn thin by betrayal. But Margaret stood her ground. She argued that Angus, her husband, had betrayed her, that he had used her title, her wealth and even her son for his own gain, that he had kept her isolated and humiliated. And for once, history did her a small kindness. She won. Her marriage was annulled. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret Tudor had something rare for women of her rank and station: autonomy. It didn't come with fanfare. No crowds cheered. No royal parade. But in the quiet chambers of the Scottish court, Margaret began to carve out a new path. Not as a queen, not as a wife, but as a mother, as a grandmother. As a woman who had weathered more storms than anyone ever expected, she became something of a quiet force in the court of her now-grown son, James V. Their relationship was never easy. How could it be, after the years of separation and influence from other nobles? But there was still connection, still affection. And through Margaret, the Tudors maintained a foothold in Scotland. Now here's a detail that often gets forgotten, but it changes everything. Margaret's lineage didn't just end with her son. Through her granddaughter, Mary, Queen of Scots, and then through her son, James VI of Scotland, came James V of England. Yes, the king who unified the crowns of England and Scotland. That means Margaret Tudor, the sister of Henry VIII, the queen who was pushed aside, divorced, and forgotten, was the grandmother of the modern British monarchy. Think about that. She may have been ignored in her own lifetime. She may have been overlooked in textbooks and dinner-table history chats. But her blood runs through every royal that followed. She's there in the coronations, the portraits, the palaces. And you know, that reminds me of something I've learned over the years. Sometimes our influence isn't loud. It's not in the headlines or the applause. Sometimes it's in the child we raised well, the advice we offered that took root, the resilience we modeled, even when no one was watching. That's Margaret's legacy, not just as a princess who disappeared, but as a woman who kept showing up, who survived widowhood, political exile, a toxic marriage, and public scorn. Who stood her ground when even the stones of the castle turned against her, and who planted the seeds of a future no one could see coming. And if you've ever felt like your contributions went unnoticed, like your name faded a bit when you stopped being someone's something, wife, mother, caregiver, title holder, just remember Margaret. She was forgotten by the people who wrote the headlines of her time, but she wasn't forgotten by history. Because the quiet strength we carry, the kind that gets us through hard marriages, lost chances, and years where we're just trying to hold the pieces together, that strength leaves traces. Maybe not in stained glass windows or gold-embossed tombs, but in the lives we touch, the stories we shape, the generations that follow, even if they don't know our name. Margaret Tudor mattered, and so do you. There's something about growing older that brings a kind of quiet clarity. You stop needing to be the loudest voice in the room. You don't fight every battle. You learn when to let go and when to stand your ground. That's where we find Margaret Tudor now. She had faced more than her share of storms, married off at 13, widowed by 24, pushed out of power, betrayed by her second husband, and still she stood. Still she moved forward. Still she tried to keep her family intact, and in her later years something remarkable happened. People began to see her not as a threat or a pawn, but as something steadier, a survivor, a matriarch. She no longer had a throne, no longer wore a crown. But she carried something even more powerful, experience. Margaret became a trusted figure in Scottish politics, not always beloved, but respected. She advised her son, King James V, with the kind of insight that only comes from being burned and betrayed and still choosing not to become bitter. She understood alliances, and she understood loss. And sometimes that makes you the best person to listen to. She had known what it was to be a queen, and she had known what it was to be alone. In her final years, Margaret lived modestly. Not poor, not exiled, but far from the grandeur that once surrounded her. Her health declined. She was no longer central to the great chessboard of politics. But she remained active, writing letters, voicing opinions, and always, trying to keep the peace between her children and between the two kingdoms she had once straddled, England and Scotland. And then, in 1541, at the age of 51, Margaret Tudor passed away quietly in Methven Castle, a place far less royal than the palaces she once walked, but perhaps more peaceful. Her death did not make headlines in England. Her brother, Henry VIII, didn't even attend her funeral. And for a time it seemed Margaret would slip from memory altogether. But as we've learned, disappearing from the spotlight isn't the same as being forgotten, because it was Margaret's bloodline, not Henry's, that would carry the Tudor name into the future. Her granddaughter, Mary, Queen of Scots, would become a legendary figure in her own right, tragic, powerful, and unforgettable. And from Mary's line would come James VI of Scotland, who became James V of England after Elizabeth. I died without an heir. That meant it was Margaret's great-grandson, not her brother's child, who inherited the English throne. The union of the crowns, the beginning of the modern United Kingdom. That's no small legacy. And what strikes me most is this. Margaret never lived to see that happen. She never knew the weight of what she'd passed on. She never saw her name written in golden letters. And she never got to watch as her line stitched two countries together, but that doesn't make her less important. In fact, it makes her story even more powerful, because how many of us will plant seeds we'll never see grow? We show up for our families, we do the hard things, we keep going even when it feels thankless, we forgive even when it's hard. We love even when it hurts. And so often we don't get the credit, we don't get the fanfare, but that doesn't mean our efforts vanish. They ripple forward in ways we may never fully understand. Margaret Tudor's life wasn't easy. It wasn't neat. It was filled with contradictions. She was royal but often powerless. She was strong but frequently silenced. She was ambitious but always tethered to men who couldn't match her resilience. And yet here we are, talking about her, remembering her, reclaiming her story from the shadows. And maybe that's the real takeaway, that even when we feel like we've been written out of the story, the truth still finds a way through. That dignity isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just persistence. Sometimes it's simply surviving, quietly, gracefully, through the long years and the hard seasons. Margaret didn't get a heroic ending. She didn't ride into battle or die in a blaze of glory. She didn't leave behind famous paintings or great monuments, but she left behind something far more lasting, a lineage, a legacy, and a story worth telling. And maybe that's the reminder we all need, especially as we get older, that life doesn't have to be grand to be meaningful. That strength isn't just in how you rise, it's in how you carry on when no one's watching. That love, loyalty, and quiet perseverance might just be the most powerful legacy of all. So wherever you are, listening from a cozy chair, winding down after a long day, maybe sipping your evening tea, I hope Margaret's story brings you a little comfort, because your story matters too. Maybe it won't be written in history books, maybe there won't be paintings on palace walls, but the care you give, the strength you've shown, the wisdom you've passed down, that's the kind of legacy no one can erase. And if Margaret Tudor, the sister who disappeared, still echoes through royal history, then you, my friend, are surely leaving behind something just as extraordinary. There's a beautiful kind of peace that comes with finishing a story, not just because it ends, but because it lingers. You carry it with you, like the scent of something warm in a quiet kitchen long after the oven's been turned off. Margaret Tudor's story lingers that way. It's soft, it's solemn, but it stays. She didn't live to see the crowns united. She didn't know that her quiet determination would echo through generations of monarchs. She likely didn't feel like a legacy at all, and isn't that true for many of us? We often look back and wonder, what did it all amount to? Were the years we poured into our families, our work, our choices, were they enough? Margaret's life in many ways answers that. She didn't change the world with a single act. She didn't wield a sword or pass sweeping reforms. Instead, she endured. She persisted. She held on to dignity when the world tried to shake it from her hands. And most importantly, she kept showing up. And maybe that's the real lesson she leaves behind. That legacy isn't always loud. It's not always in headlines or statues or songs. Sometimes it's in the quiet strength of someone who gets back, up when it would be easier to stay down. Someone who keeps writing letters, keeps trying to reconnect, keeps offering love, even when it isn't returned in kind. Margaret's voice was often drowned out by the thundering drama of her brother Henry. And yet here we are, centuries later, telling her story, because in the end that's what we remember, not the noise, but the people who endured it with grace. Maybe your name won't be carved in stone, and maybe it doesn't need to be, because your life, the way you've loved, the way you've stayed, the way you've survived, that's written in the hearts of the people you've touched. That's your monument. And if you've ever felt like you were fading a bit, like your time to shine had already passed, please remember this. Margaret's most powerful chapter came after her crown had slipped. After the palace doors had closed, after the applause had faded, that's when her legacy quietly took root. So maybe now, as the world spins faster and the years seem to move more quickly than they once did, maybe this is your time too. Not to climb ladders or chase spotlights, but to settle into your place in the story with purpose, with pride, and with peace. Let yourself be remembered for the warmth you gave, for the steadiness you offered, for the way you carried history forward even when you didn't realize it. You are not invisible. You are not forgotten, and like Margaret, your story matters deeply. Thank you for sitting with this one. I hope you found a little comfort in it, maybe even a bit of yourself. And if you did, I hope you'll leave a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from or what part of her story spoke to you most. And if you'd like more quiet moments like this, stories that linger, soften and soothe, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe. We're building something gentle here, something human, because the world may be loud, but you don't have to be. Here's to living your truth, to holding your ground, and to knowing that the softest voices often carry the furthest. Until next time, rest well. And remember, you're still part of the story. Some stories don't really end, they just settle, like dust in sunlight, like the last note of a lullaby that fades into stillness, but never quite disappears. Margaret Tudor's life was full of beginnings and breaks, so being used, dismissed, forgotten, and then remembered. Not loudly, not in the way of kings and conquerors, but in that gentle, steady way that truly lasting things are remembered. In the world of royalty, power is usually measured in crowns and signatures, land and bloodlines. But Margaret's power was something quieter. She didn't shape empires with armies, but with resilience. She didn't conquer countries, but she outlived schemes. And through it all, she remained deeply human. Even her faults, her sometimes impulsive choices, her complicated marriages, her missteps, make her feel more real, don't they? It's easy to admire someone perfect, but it's easier to connect with someone who tried, who stumbled and kept walking anyway. She wasn't a saint. She was a woman, doing her best in a world that demanded everything and offered little in return. I often think about her final years. Margaret, who once lived in palaces, walked now through halls grown quieter. The echoes weren't from courtiers anymore, but from her own memories. There was time, finally, to reflect on the family she was born into, on the countries she had belonged to and been exiled from, on the son she had protected and the granddaughter she would never meet, who would one day carry her legacy to the scaffold. That's the thing about getting older, isn't it? We accumulate more questions than answers. We find ourselves looking back, wondering which moments truly mattered. Not always the loud ones. Sometimes it was the quiet decisions, the ones no one saw, that shaped everything after. Margaret's story tells us that what matters most isn't always obvious at the time. Maybe it was in that first marriage, when she learned diplomacy as a teenager far from home. Maybe it was in those letters she kept writing, long after others stopped listening. Maybe it was in surviving the betrayal of a second husband and reclaiming her name in a court that wanted to forget her. And maybe, just maybe, it was in being the thread that quietly held two countries together, even when no one said thank you. We rarely get to see the full impact of our lives while we're still living them, but that doesn't mean they aren't meaningful. So if you're watching this now and feeling like your story has grown quiet, or your name no longer carries the weight it used to, please, I invite you to see Margaret not as a fading figure, but as a mirror, because you're still part of something. Your experiences still echo. Your story still shapes others, even if they don't realize it yet. Whether it's in the way you comfort your children, or the patience you offer in a hurried world, or the wisdom you share when someone needs it most, you are leaving something behind. And that something matters. And isn't that a lovely thought? That even when we feel we've disappeared a little from the center of the room, our presence is still felt, like Margaret, a sister, a queen, a mother, a survivor, and in the end, a woman who endured. Maybe you know what that feels like. Maybe you've been the glue that held people together. Maybe you've stayed strong in seasons when others drifted. Maybe you've chosen love and loyalty, even when it cost you comfort or recognition. If so, then I think you and Margaret would have understood each other perfectly. Her life reminds us that grace isn't always about elegance, it's about endurance. And legacy isn't always about what the world applauds, it's about what the heart remembers. So wherever this finds you, late at night with your tea still warm, or mid-afternoon as sunlight creeps across the floor, I hope this moment has given you something small but meaningful, a breath, a thought, a quiet kind of companionship. Thank you for sharing this time with me. And thank you for holding space for Margaret, who may have disappeared from the spotlight, but never from the story. You are not alone, and neither was she. Here's to the quiet ones, here's to you, sweet dreams.